money within an institution and within a university fluctuates a lot and is not readily available and transparent to everybody. Now getting to the funding part, right? Okay, you took the exam, you've submitted your scores. All right, what do we do now? So the first thing you need to know is that funding within a department is completely an internal dynamic and it fluctuates. I mean, I can't even tell you how untransparent it can be sometimes, where the money is coming from and who is supposed to receive it when it comes to graduate students, when it comes to students already working on the dissertation, or students who are still in the master's section of their PhD, right? If the PhD is the example. So ultimately, each program you're applying to is going to have their own internal process for funding. Some programs will only take on students if they can fully fund every single one that they take on. That's just their internal process. And some programs are going to let you know before you apply that you need to allocate all of your own funding throughout the entire duration of that program. So these are questions, and this is something you need to have in mind before you select a program, right? So while your GRE score can help determine funding distributions, that is completely up to the graduate committee's discretion. You might not ever really know how it is that they decided that student A gets this funding package and student B gets a different one. So a lot of this is unclear and unavailable, but some of it can be transparent. And that is, you'll typically get more insight into that once you have been admitted into a program and you receive a funding letter, right? That comes later, but just know that sometimes when you're applying, there are many competitive applicants, right? And they all have wonderful, wonderful profiles that they're applying with. I mean, students come from all over the world and are all very unique and competitive thinkers. And unfortunately, sometimes the GRE and the GPA is the easiest way to fall back and say, okay, when it comes down to the numbers, how do we decide who gets this extra summer funding package? How are we going to decide that? How are we going to allocate that? And these are things that differ per year too, per application cycle. So one example is when I applied to my program, my institution was not technically a Hispanic serving institution. Recently, UC Santa Barbara has become a Hispanic serving institution, which means that they get a lot of extra funding. And eventually that trickles down to graduate students. So that wasn't available when I applied. And there was truly no way for me to know that. And that's not a reflection of me as an applicant or, my contribution. It's just the way that funding works at institutions sometimes. So a lot of this is a guessing game sometimes. You shoot the best score you can, you write the best essays you can, you do your very best at the interview. But at the end of the day, money within an institution and within a university is something that fluctuates a lot and that is not necessarily readily available and transparent to everybody who applies. Yes, this is my slide. Okay, so funding is negotiable, actually. And that's something that I was not aware of when I was applying, and I didn't really learn about this until later. But funding is negotiable once you have been accepted. But in order to do this, you need to fully understand the funding package that you received. So typically, once you are accepted, you've done your interviews, you visited the program, you're like, yeah, it's a go for me. The department will distribute a funding letter to you. And that is basically like the document that's going to detail where your funding is coming from, how it's going to be distributed over the entirety of the program, and how to expect to receive it, and actually the real amount that you're going to be getting. So when I received my funding letter, I didn't fully understand how that would break down. I actually just revisited it a couple days ago and I was like, wow, I did not know how to read this when I first received it. I didn't understand really how it would play out. So my tip to you is that once you receive that funding letter, do your very best to break it down and actually envision how that funding will be distributed over the years. If you're applying to a PhD program, that's like 7 years. So you really want to think about, okay, year one, I'm getting this amount of funding. Year two, it changes into this. Once I'm ABD, which means everything but dissertation, this is the amount of funding I will get. And you will compare every single one of those letters from programs you are accepted to. This is where the negotiation comes in. If you are applying or if you've been accepted to two programs that are comparable, let's say you applied to the University of California system. Let's say you got into UCLA and UC Berkeley. Those schools are very comparable and they're very competitive with each other. That is a perfect scenario to negotiate with. Let's say you got into two Ivy League schools, or let's say you got into Harvard and Yale, let's just say. Exactly the same, right? They're very comparable and they're very competitive. That is the perfect scenario to negotiate. If you were to tell the department at UC Berkeley, hey, I really want to come to your program. I'm really interested for all of these reasons. However, UCLA is offering me summer funding for year 3 and 4, as well as a conference stipend of X amount. Do you think you can offer something comparable? That is when they'll turn back the review committee or the graduate committee and say, okay, do we want this student because they are contributing in a research area that we don't currently have any graduate students in, but we want to say that our department is working towards? Do you see how that internal dynamic can actually turn into more money for you? So that is when you would send your request. And very often, actually, I know students who have done this. They're a lot wittier than I was at the time, and they have been able to beef up their package. And sometimes, it's just a summer funding in between your comp exams. Sometimes it's just a little bit more for those conferences. Sometimes it's just covering those fees, those university fees you might have to pay for using the printer and using the gym, all of these different things, but they do add up. And that's why I really recommend just reading that letter as closely as you can, asking someone else, another graduate student, if you know any, to read it for you and help you break it down so that you are really sharp on what it is that funding package really entails. And so that you can actually ask and say, hey, you know what? This looks great and I'm really ready to join, but I'm wondering if there's any possibility that you can offer summer funding year 2 to 3 when I expect to be collecting data, right? Something like that. You can ask those questions. And most likely, if they've already accepted you, they are going to see if they have that extra funding available. And they might poke around into extra donors or other resources, and it's worth asking. So I just want to emphasize that because I think that's the later step that students kind of miss is like, okay, I'm already accepted, but can I still negotiate a little bit? Is there a little bit more wiggle room? And honestly, most of the time there is, because guess what? Some of the people who have been accepted are not going to they're not going to go to that program. They're going to go somewhere else. So where does that money go? Right? There might be an extra couple grand for you that you can use for summer funding or external research or whatever that is. And it's really worth asking.